Knowing how and when to use core stratagems is a big part of 40k. I go through each one so that we have some solid ways to apply them and improve our games. Hello and welcome to Incursion Events. My name's Luke, and in this video I will be mostly talking about Core Stratagems. This is part 2 of my deep dive, and if you've missed part 1, I'll put it in the video description below. I'm really excited to get into this discussion again today. There are some really potent tricks that exist. Rapid Ingress in particular gives us some crazy things we can do in game, and I'll get onto that a bit closer to the end of the video. For now, let's get started with Smokescreen. 1 CP, you can make a smoke unit from your army a bit harder to hit. It gets the benefit of cover and stealth after it's been selected as a target of a shooting attack, which is really useful. Those dedicated transports that have dropped off their troops, if it's a transport with the smoke keyword, not all of them will have it, but for the ones that do, if you've got these units sort of sat there twiddling their thumbs, maybe they're on an objective, that's all they're really doing at this point in time. If the enemy has that transport in its sights, then if they're not factoring in that we've got access to this, it could really ruin their day. They might have estimated that the one unit they've positioned to take care of that dedicated transport is enough, but if we make it -1 to hit and potentially give the benefit of cover if we don't already have it, then that could skew the dice enough that the transport lives and we continue to score points, which is fantastic. So Smokescreen is a fantastic little strat for just 1 CP. And if we're facing into tanks with the smoke keyword, then it's something we want to be mindful of when we're positioning our units and thinking about what we're going to shoot, how much damage we need to do here and there, because a well-timed smoke screen can be really annoying to get through. Next we have Counter Offensive. 2 CP, and we get to fight out of sequence. So this comes up, for example, if we are charged by 2 separate units. So we have one of our units, one part of the board, and another one of our units on another part of the board, and each one of those units is receiving a separate charge. Normally our opponents would get to strike first as they're the charging units, but after they've chosen one, we can spend 2 CP to interrupt and say, nope, I'm going to attack with another unit over here before the other unit that charged gets to strike, which would normally hit us first. Like Heroic Intervention, this is a potentially brutal stratagem. It's 2 CP, it's quite pricey, so having 2 CP when there's charges going on is something we need to be aware of, both from us having it and our opponents having it as well. So when we are charging our opponents, if they have 2 CP, we need to either only charge with one thing so that we're not exposing ourselves to a counter-offensive, or make sure we're striking with the unit that's more fragile or the unit that's going to take the most damage back first before we just dive in with any old unit. Say we charge a big unit of Terminators with a nasty scary unit and 1 Space Marine left on a wound, and we activate the combat with the Space Marine first and kill it. The enemy could spend 2 CP to counter-offensive with their nasty Terminator unit and do some damage to our nasty combat unit first. Whereas if we activate the nasty combat unit first, do some damage to the Terminators, the 2 CP counter-offensive on 1 Space Marine is nowhere near as appealing. Suffice to say, whether charging or being charged, 2 CP is the magic number to be thinking about. And more often than not, if we've got 2 CP available, if we've been careful and tried to avoid the Heroic Intervention, or our opponent has tried to avoid the Heroic Intervention, then the 2 CP is likely to be there for a counter-offensive. It's often more relevant in games than Heroic Intervention. And this is because Heroic Intervention can be played around, and so the 2 CP will often still be there for a counter-offensive. Counter-offensive is a tough lesson to learn, and generally speaking, people understand it now and will play around it and say, well, I'll go with that unit first. And I've seen games, even at tournaments, where people will resolve combats and they'll start to resolve the one they shouldn't be resolving first, and their opponent will say, I assume you're resolving this one over here first, actually, instead? Yeah, of course, I should be doing that one first to avoid counter-offensive, but I've started here now, silly me, thanks for calling it out. And, we're all aware of it as a stratagem, and I often see really good conversations around counter-offensive. People aren't necessarily trying to gotcha their opponent, and they'll talk about it to the point where oftentimes I'll see people say, oh, so we'll resolve this one here first because you don't want me to interrupt. And it's like, yeah, thanks. Which is a fantastic thing to see and something I encourage every player to do at every level. It's fully establishing that intent so that there's no awkwardness. Before we get to the next strat, I just want to share some content creators that are friends of the channel. Epic Flail, Return to the Old World, and Bored Stupid. Links to their channel are in the video description below. They put out some awesome stuff and it's well worth checking them out. Once you've finished this video in full, of course, and liked it and subscribed to the channel. Hey. Okay, cheesy gags aside, let's crack on. Next up is Fire Overwatch. This is arguably one of the nastiest stratagems in the game. Before or after you essentially move, charge, or advance, or fall back, you can get shot in your own turn. It's not very nice. got to be within 24, and you can only do this once per turn, and the only downside to using this stratagem, you need 6s to hit. I won't go into too much detail, but lots of units in the game have access to rerolls to hit or exploding hits, so more hits when they get 6s. So there are certain units that you don't want to get Overwatched by. Perhaps they've got a torrent weapon, so they just hit you automatically. It's unpleasant. Probably the most unpopular stratagem in the game, and it often creates little speed bumps in the game throughout the game. So we go to move, and then we realise, oh, we can get Overwatched. Or our opponent is kind enough to say, I can actually get an angle to you there. If you move there, I can Overwatch you with this really nasty, devastating unit. And then we say, I really appreciate that. Or we've suddenly just realised ourselves, and we think, okay, now I have to move over here. So it's something that we constantly need to be aware of when we're moving, or entering play from reserve, or advancing, or falling back. Falling back is particularly devastating. If you've got a unit that you're trying to keep alive and you fall back, risk getting shot, it's a lose-lose. One trick to get around this that I really like is we check, can we Overwatch that unit at the start of the move? So when you go to start falling back, your opponent can't Overwatch you because you're engaged with an enemy, so you can't be shot. If you're able to end the move out of line of sight from that unit that could Overwatch you, perhaps behind a ruin, for example, a line of sight blocking ruin, well, at the end of the movement phase, suddenly you're no longer in line of sight, so you can't be Overwatched. So that's a good way we can protect ourselves from Overwatch when we're falling back specifically. Beyond that, using terrain, we need to hide behind line of sight blocking ruins or terrain as much as possible, and then we can't get Overwatched. It's as simple as that. Sometimes this might make our charges slightly longer if we have to hide, but it's well worth it to avoid being Overwatched in those situations. Again, it comes down to not giving our opponents a free activation if we can avoid it. To get the most out of Overwatch, it's deploying defensively. If we can get high enough onto pieces of terrain where we can see over the terrain, but deployed high enough that we get the benefit of plunging fire, that's a nice way of getting an additional buff to our Overwatch damage. The best ways to get the most out of Overwatch come down to positioning to support other units, so that if one or both are threatened, we have an Overwatch to try and defend against that. Torrent weapons are very good, so putting them in a prominent place so that if our opponent wants to move up, ready to get them, they have to go through the torrent. It makes it unappealing. It allows us to exert board control, and sometimes the threat of the Overwatch might be enough that it deters the enemy from going towards a certain part of the board, which is a fantastic thing. I've talked about threat ranges in previous video, and that is particularly useful to understand and leverage when we're thinking about Overwatch with our units. There's a really nasty trick that I've been victim to regarding Overwatch, which I'll share when I get to the final stratagem. But before I do, we're moving on to grenades. Grenade is one of my favourite stratagems. It's 1 CP, it's really, really cheap, and it is an opportunity to dish out mortal wounds to our opponents. We need the grenades keyword, and we need to be up close and personal, but it is really potent. It's capped at 6 because we roll 6 dice. For each dice we roll a 4 up on, we do mortal wounds. Now, an astute viewer might call me out and say, well, 1 CP for a chance at doing mortal wounds. Tank shot, grenade, a chance at doing mortal wounds. There's a chance we could spend the CP and do nothing, like with the command roll, which you poo-pooed. That is very, very true. There is a flaw to this, which is we do nothing, but the upside is we do 6 mortal wounds. Abilities that do mortal wounds are just straight up powerful, and powerful enough that it's worth it. On average, we should be doing 3 mortal wounds. 6 dice with a 50% chance on each of those dice that we will do a mortal wound. We should be expecting 3 mortal wounds on average. So there's a consistent output on average with the grenade, compared to the command reroll where there's a whole variety of different outcomes you could get. If I needed a 6 on a dice roll for something, I wouldn't spend a CP to command reroll it 99% of the time. Whereas if I can use grenade stratagems and I can afford the CP, I will use it, because a chance to do mortal wounds is more often than not really, really useful. And again, it's all about compounding damage. If we think of a scenario where we're advancing on an enemy position and we shoot, we use the grenade stratagem. We then have a little charge. We then get tank shock in there as well. We could be doing up to 12 mortal wounds on the grenade and tank shock strats alone, to say nothing of the shooting and the charge as well. So when you start adding all of those effects up, it can lead to some really potent turns. It's a really solid stratagem. There's not really an awful lot more to say about it other than it's a really good additional way of dealing damage, which sometimes is what we need to do, is just kill the enemy units. And the grenade strat really helps with that. Lastly, we have rapid ingress for 1 CP. 1 CP. End of your opponent's movement phase, one of our enemy units that's hidden away in reserves can enter the battlefield, just as if it was the reinforcement step of our own turn. Can't bring on units to arrive any earlier than they would normally be allowed to do so, but this is a fantastic stratagem, and again, probably a little bit underused. I'm a big believer in deployment and movement winning games, more so than shooting and combat. ultimately we need to be in certain places on the board to win the game, and rapid ingress massively helps with that. This being something that every faction has access to, used in conjunction with strategic reserves. Normally when we do that, we're limited to how far we can move in our turn, but if we've thought ahead and rapid ingressed, we've already brought them on, and then in our turn we get to move them. This could be really, really important for getting into position. Rapid ingress is fantastic, and when we're moving in our own turns, it should always be in the forefront of our mind where we're going to screen out rapid ingress. If our opponent has got any units in reserve, we do not want to be allowing them an easy rapid ingress out of sight or out of charge range, allowing them to freely bring on a unit. So we want to be defending against that as much as possible. And also, every movement phase of our opponents, we need to constantly have in our minds, tick-tock, is it rapid ingress o'clock? Once they've ended their movement phase, is there going to be a benefit to bringing a unit on now and then netting some extra move effectively in the subsequent movement phase? A timely rapid ingress can open up some really effective firing lanes. It can allow better charges. It can get us closer to objectives that we would otherwise be a bit too far to get to. It is very, very powerful and an excellent core stratagem. And really, all that extra movement, shooting, combat and objective grabbing potential, we are only just scratching the surface with what we can do with rapid ingress. The possibilities when we start to combine this with other stratagems are really quite powerful. Take a nice and simple one like grenades, or tank shock for example. If we have a unit with the grenades keyword or a vehicle in reserve, with careful placement using rapid ingress, we can put them somewhere down on the table, out of line of sight so we're not getting shot at, out of charge range so we're not getting charged in our opponent's turn. When it comes back to our turn, we can then move and get into position to be able to use grenades with our grenades unit, or get that charge with a vehicle and use tank shock. And so the combination of these stratagems, if we're then combining that with the additional movement, ability to get objectives, shooting, charges that I mentioned, that is unlocked from rapid ingress anyway, it just adds more layers of pain onto this little combo. And that's not all. We can combine it with other out of sequence movement as well, such as heroic intervention. Where this is useful is primarily as a defensive measure. It requires a bit of forward thinking and a bit of planning to make work, but it can be very, very powerful if we use it in the right way. So in this scenario we have some orc boys that want to charge some plague drones. Chaos Demons are a really great use case for how we can get the most out of this, as all of the units automatically can enter play from Deep Strike, and being able to enter play using Deep Strike, not just strategic reserves, unlocks a greater level of flexibility with this stratagem. But if we do have something in strategic reserves, provided we're close enough to a board edge, we can still potentially utilise this trick. It's just going to be a lot more difficult with positioning versus if we have something in reserve being able to do this that can Deep Strike. At the end of the Orc player's movement phase, the Demon player brings on a unit of Flesh Hounds using rapid ingress. With this positioning, the Demon player has met the requirement to deploy outside of 9 inches from the enemy unit, and also set it up that they are within heroic intervention range, within 6 inches of wherever the Orc boy unit could end up once they're in charge range. So essentially you can see here there's a nice little 6-inch range way past the potential engagement range of that first plague drone, so that no matter where the Orc boys end the charge, the Flesh Hounds will be able to use a heroic intervention. They will trigger that because there's no way that the boys can end in engagement range and be outside of 6 inches of that Flesh Hound unit. No, it's not ideal that the Flesh Hounds are positioned in a way that makes them now an eligible charge target. And so when we're setting this up in our real world games, we want to factor that in. Can we position ourselves in such a way that we can threaten that heroic intervention, 100% guaranteed, but also be far enough away that we're not an eligible charge target, which more often than not would be better, because we want to be heroic intervening and tagging units in a way that suits us, as that's the whole shtick here with this combination. If the unit gets the charge off, it prevents us from being able to heroic intervention, and we want to use that heroic intervention as a way of move blocking our opponent, as you'll see in a moment. Yes, we've exposed the Flesh Hounds to just being charged anyway, but what it does mean is that in order for them to do that, the Orc player would need to roll higher on the charge. So if they do go for the greedier charge, trying to get the Flesh Hounds as well, is actually reducing the odds that they even make it in the first place, and by quite a significant margin. So in this scenario, the Orc boys just charge the plague drones. If we say they roll strictly average and get a 7-inch move, the Orc boys charge in. All the models that can physically make it into base-to-base contact with the charge distance rolled have to make it into base contact and do so, and then the rest of the unit moves up. 4 models in base-to-base contact and an additional 2 models in base-to-base contact with another model in base-to-base contact, and normally they get another 3-inch pile-in move to be able to get the remaining 4 boys that are not in base contact to be able to fight. But before the pile-in, we get our Heroic Intervention. Fleshhounds in this example are particularly great at this because they get to use Heroic Intervention for free as part of their datasheet, which is another great reason to consider Fleshhounds if you're playing World Eaters and you want demon allies, playing demons and you just want some extra uses for your chaff units. These Fleshhounds are great for that. Outside of the Chaos factions, this is still a relevant trick you can do, even if you have to pay the CP for it. Yes, it's quite expensive, but it's still something that is very valuable to be aware of and perhaps consider using in games when it becomes relevant. So the Fleshhounds use Heroic Intervention. Each of the Fleshhounds gets a 6-inch move, and the objective here is to get into base-to-base contact with as many models that are not currently in base-to-base contact with our Plague Drone unit, or that are not currently base-to-base contact with another Orc model that's in contact with our Plague Drone unit. Because we get to do this Heroic Intervention before their final pile-in, we can effectively prevent them piling in when it gets to the pile-in step and reduce the amount of attacks that go onto our Plague Drones. So in this scenario, the Fleshhounds are absolutely being used as a sacrificial unit here to divert attacks away from the Plague Drones, which are sitting on an objective. And so using the Fleshhounds here, it forces the Orc player to split their attacks, reduce the likelihood of the Plague Drones being killed, and also tag the Orc player at a distance that is not near that objective. So there's a number of things being achieved here. If the Demon player hadn't deployed a unit of Hounds in this way, a very likely outcome is the boys storm in and they just wipe out the Plague Drones. And even if they don't wipe them out, it's very, very likely they'll be able to tag onto that objective with more OC than the Plague Drones and claim it. In this scenario, the Demons player has added more OC to the objective to protect it and reduced the amount of damage going into the Plague Drones, and also potentially adding more attacks into that combat than the Plague Drones would have been able to offer. So not only have they denied the Orcs the objective, they're adding more potential damage into the combat and increasing the likelihood that the Plague Drones will survive. So if we've got more important units that we want to keep alive, this is a great example of how we can use these stratagems to try and achieve that. Sacrifice a weaker chaff unit to keep another unit alive. I mentioned earlier a final way of utilising Overwatch. I was on the receiving end of a brutal Overwatch as a result of a rapid ingress. In a very recent game that I played, I had a unit of Gene Stealers, fast combat unit that can do devastating wounds, and it had a unit in their sights, a unit of nasty Votan Terminators, I forget what they're called, and I made painstaking effort to pre-measure, confirm with my opponent, had a chat, said, look, I want to charge that unit of Terminators, I want to get to them, do my best to avoid Overwatch. So I'm starting my turn behind a wall, and I'm going to jump out and end my turn behind another wall, so you won't be able to Overwatch me. My opponent looked at the angle and said, yeah, it sucks, but I can't Overwatch you. I moved my unit out, put it behind a wall, set up a charge from behind a wall, so again, when I charge, I can't be Overwatched. Happy days. My opponent then, after I've moved everything else, I just want a rapid ingress. I was like, yeah, of course, fine, rapid ingress. I'd done a grand job of screening out my entire deployment zone and a vast chunk of no man's land with my units at this point. I can't stop rapid ingressing in his side of the board. He brings on some heavy weapons that now have an angle to the Gene Stealers. I then go to charge and he overwatches with that unit he's rapid ingressed on. I lost 9 Gene Stealers, so the Patriarch and 1 Gene Stealer hobbled into the charge and it was devastating. At that point I charged anyway, as the Gene Stealers either charge and get overwhelmed or they sit there in that ruin and get shot to pieces. It was a really brutal lesson in the 1-2 punch of rapid ingress combined with Overwatch. So if you've got a nasty shooting unit that you can rapid ingress, you can use Overwatch defensively in that way as well. It's a bit of a CP commitment and some forward thinking involved, but it just shows you that power of rapid ingress in being where you need to be at a given moment. Had my opponent not done that, very comfortably would have put a significant amount of damage into his key damage dealing unit. So from my opponent's perspective, well worth bringing a unit in to delete those Gene Stealers to protect his key damage dealing unit. It meant his other heavy unit was a bit out of position for the rest of the game, but again, it was worth the trade-off in that scenario. And hopefully that illustrates some interesting things to think about. That's all our core stratagems. This is a bit of fun, this ranking. I feel like it's a nice visual to show the strats that you're likely to see the most in-game, and how I've qualified the rankings, the cost, its setup, and its actual tangible impacts on the game. So from the bottom up, you've got C. They're not great, not terrible. The strats are basically average. They're okay. The uses are more limited, more niche, and the fail states can be significantly worse than others. B are the good strats, reliable, they get the job done, they rarely disappoint. A are the top dogs, these are seen in most games, and it's because they're the most powerful, and they have the biggest consistent impact. These are also the stratagems that will punish you for not playing around them. And that for me is the big reason why those ones are ranked at the top. They are always impacting the game. Even when they're not being used, the threat of them is passively altering the course of the game. You might not realize it as you're playing the game, but there are these situations, either thinking back to games we've played or that we're going to come across in the future. Oh, I can't move here because I don't want to get overwatched. I'll have to go around there. Oh, and don't get me started about the fidgety player asking if we're going to end our movement phase now, or if we're happy we've done all our movement. That's a red flag, everyone. Nothing screams, I'm about to rapid ingress, more than that question. And I say that as a cheeky GSC player. The final caveat to all of this is context is important. None of these stratagems are so bad that they never get used. Each of them have the potential to win you a game. Even the go to ground one, which is arguably the worst one in my opinion. For example, if we're in the closing turns of a game and we've got one unit left on the open, valiantly trying to hold on to an objective with nothing else to spend CP on and victory depending on that unit's survival, we wouldn't think twice about go to ground then. So whilst it's fun to rank the stratagems and talk about the good ones, the bad ones, it's not something to get hung up on. The real trick is understanding how to use them, making sure when we do, they deliver a good return on that CP investment, either in terms of damage, board control, or victory points. It's been really fun to go through the stratagems and talk about some of the ways in which I've used them or have seen them used. Even the negative experiences where I got Overwatched off the table have been really, really valuable to me and helped me to get better at the game. And hopefully this discussion has done the same for you too. Or at the very least has provided you some entertainment knowing that I suffered a bit of a beating in that game. Either way, that wraps up my deep dive into the core stratagems. They form an integral part of the game, and it's really, really good to have a handle on these stratagems and how we can best apply them. But it's not the be-all and end-all. In fact, sometimes it's really good just to take a step back and start at the beginning. Think about how we can set up for success. Literally, in the deployment phase, how we set up our models for success in our game. And I made a video on this to help break down some key things to think about in our deployment, which you can check out here, and it forms the first in this series of tactical advice and tips to improve our games of 40k. I hope you got something out of this video. Thank you very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice, and stay tuned for more.